we have been, for a while ago, we have been talking about my story in Turkey. I'm a public intellectual, I can say, and nowadays I'm under pressure and I cannot talk publicly very much. I'm not on the TVs. Now I'm working in my office mostly. So I stopped actually talking. I'm not talking about that. I'm doing a program about cooking and gastronomy. And while doing that, I'm talking with my guests during that time. And I told the people, sometimes they ask me, why aren't you on the TVs and you're not on the debates? I say, this is a way of protest myself. I mean, I'm doing Turkish cuisines on the TV shows, and I'm talking about technology, family life, and these kind of things, because it is a way for me to how can I protect myself. Otherwise, it's not easy to be out, continue with your work and be on the TVs and continue with your social life. So many of the intellectuals in Turkey are under pressure. And in the meeting that we have been together in Austria, somebody wanted me to talk about my story. And I said, this is not my story. This is a story of a country. This is a story of my country. I mean, it's not only me. There are thousands, tens of thousands of people like me. So let me tell you, it is not the story of me or my country. It's the story of the world societies now. Now, what we're talking is the story of all of us nowadays. Things are changing. Well, when the first days of the decades and the first minutes, I can say, when the first minutes of the millennium, we were talking about wonderful things. So we were very happy. And the only thing that is difficult to understand or that gives us a notion of risk was the Y2K syndrome, which means the collapse of the computer systems. You may remember the year 2000 was a year that creates opportunities in our minds. We were drinking champagnes and everything was great. Nothing happened when we get into the 21st century, but suddenly a new world has begun. I mean, not only a century, it is something else. Because with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we thought that this is going to be a period of endisms, the end of the ideologies, the end of the Cold War, the end of bad things and everything. And that decade was a happy decade. We were very optimistic at those times. And the liberal values were spreading around the whole world. And we were always thinking that we're going to democratize, human rights will be our main concern, these kind of things. But suddenly 9/11 came, and we have started to witness the new age of crisis, global crisis. 21st century was not like 20th century. 20th century was an era of global wars. But 21st century is going to be an era of global crisis. The first crisis was 9/11. It was a crisis of security, military one. The second one was an economic crisis. In 2008, we witnessed the global crisis. And the third one is the health crisis, the global pandemic we're talking about. So within this 20 years, we have witnessed 3 global crises that it changed all our world. In 2018, I published a book, and the topic of the book was the wall. And the last sentence of my book was, a cold winter is coming, because I was witnessing the transformation of the security systems, the state establishments, mentalities, how the societies are changing, and how the world is surrounded by border walls. Because in 1989, we were talking about the eradicating of a wall. The wall was a metaphor of global liberal values, new belief systems and freedoms and these kind of things. Now, with Trump, we have started to talk about walls, but it is not erecting a wall, not eradicating, it's erecting a wall. And in 1989, there were only a dozen of border walls in the world. Now we have 80 countries who are building border walls that surrounds their territories. So a walled society, a psychology of walls creates a new understanding of worlds relationships, interactions between groups, between people, between states, and between the actors, state actors and non-state actors. So nowadays I started to plan about a new book, and the topic, I plan to use a topic, the cave. The people who are living in the cave. I want to talk about the cave syndrome. So if you let me, I think we're going to create a dialogue. I want to talk with you about this cave syndrome. It's not maybe a psychological disease in your, I don't know your literature very much in that sense, but we're all in a cave now with this pandemic. And we are pushed in a cave. We are forced to live in a cave. And the basic feature of living in a cave is it is not like a house. A house has windows. In a cave, you don't have windows. If you're living in a cave, in a house, you're going to have neighborhood around you. I mean, your neighbors, people can come to you, visit you. You can have a garden in your house. But in a cave, you are isolated from everybody. It is only you and your very close groups. I want to ask you this question: are you agree with me that we are coming closer to a cave syndrome? And according to Plato's allegory, if you are in a cave, you cannot follow the world or watch around yourself from a window. It is a real post-truth era. We were talking about the shadows, and the shadows that is reflected on the walls. I mean, the walls are now the screens, the computers, the televisions. It's a real post-truth, but we're now in the ancient Greek areas. How do you think, John? Can we talk about the cave syndrome?
I think it's a very interesting analogy indeed, Deniz. And I remember your book, The Wall, and how you pointed up that much of the development of civilization was about walls, the walls of houses, the walls around cities that protected people. So they came together for protection and they built a wall around them. And of course, we had got to the point of thinking that now we could take the walls down and we would be free. Globalization would take us beyond the question of walls. And that had a lot of resonance for me, because in Northern Ireland, we had to build walls to protect people from each other. I mean, these walls were built at the request of people. The Berlin Wall was built to keep people from moving about. The walls in our cities in Northern Ireland were built at the request of people who wanted to be protected from each other. So I was very much aware of that. And that book was, as you say, in the final comments of the book, pointing up that we were moving into a time that was not going to be characterized by what we wanted to see: freedom to trade, to travel, to move about, to engage with each other and so on. But it was going to be characterized by these walls, and what could we do about the walls? So I think it's a very interesting notion, this of the cave, but you must have other thoughts about it.
Yeah, sure. Actually, when we look at the cave psychology, then we came to a new dimension of political analysis. It is about biopolitics, because in a cave, you're not dealing with culture, art, sports, these kind of things. This is a notion of survival. So you have to rescue your body from everywhere. And the ones who are dominating you, who are giving you the information, are pushing you inside the cave, so they have a mandate over your body. The government announces that you have to go and stay at your houses. You have to be locked. These are the lockdown measures. You have to be vaccinated. You have to take a PCR test. Now the government started to play over our bodies, and we are voluntarily the instruments of the governments, and they are showing us how they could be, how much they can become totalitarian. It is now inside our lives. It's not only at the political realm or economic realm that the government intervenes. Now the governments are saying that we are controlling your bodies too. You cannot send your children to the schools. Let's stop it. Okay, we're at home. You cannot go out and go to shopping. Okay, we're at home and we're there. So the government, some of the governments provide free healthcare systems, some of them not. Thousands have died because they cannot reach to the hospitals because of monetary reasons, because of regulations and laws. And then people started debating over the governmental systems. The liberal capitalists, in the liberal capitalist systems, if you don't have the money, the hospitals didn't provide you, many of them, of course, didn't provide you free health system. But in the others, in China, in Russia, in Turkey, it is for free if you want to take a treatment for COVID. $30,000 budget, I mean, for every person. So the government, you have to obey the rules of the government. The government may say, for example, Turkish government, you cannot take my benefits. You cannot provide any, we cannot provide you any free health services. They can easily tell you about that because you are not supporting my ideology. And so everybody has to obey the state establishment in order to stay alive, in order to live. Take free health care systems. I mean, the government, this is voluntary. It is very interesting, actually. For example, now it's not only at the local governmental models. Look at, I mean, I couldn't come to Britain. Why? Because the British government announced that Turkish people, even if they are vaccinated, even if they had their COVID case before, we don't care. Even if they had PCRs, they have to get into the quarantine for 10 days. Why? I'm vaccinated. I had COVID, in March. I am healthy. I can have the PCR test, but the British government said, you are Turkish and you cannot get into my country. So this is a political discrimination. At the international level, there is a huge domination, a strong domination over the people, their local citizens and the people and the others who want to come to the country. So the borders, the territories became more and more under control and important. So there are lots of other things for sure. I mean, the refugee problems, the terrorism problems, we may think about that, but this government and the citizen relationship, or the state people, the individual relationship, it is transforming into a new style, a new dimension, I can say. In order to get the necessary service from your government, in order to become a free, reputable, good person, and feeling good, actually, you have to obey the rules of your government and also the other countries' governments too. So there are level that controls our lives. So according to me, the 21st century crisis, all of them, all the global crises, empowered the state systems, the establishments. The first global crisis was about security systems. It changed everything into it. I mean, it's a securitization process. Even if you're talking about human rights in countries like me, it became a threat to democracy, or it became a threat to your territorial integrity or betrayal. It is considered as betrayal. Even if you want free universities, we don't want to pay money, the university students, they protest because they have to pay money to the universities. They become, they are in prison, some of them, because they became betrayers to the whole country's ideology and these kind of things, because they are not thinking about their country's reputation. They are trying to harm the government processes and the regime. So everybody is a threat to democracy. This is the first one. We witnessed how Guantanamo operated, how CIA flights to different countries have done. We have witnessed lots of anti-democratic measures after the securitization process with the 9/11. Then came the economic crisis. The state establishment this time get into the market systems. They started regulating the economic systems, all the regulations. The state as an economic actor take the power of all the global markets. So they started the government central banks started designing the whole financial regulations. So this non-state actors of financial interactions started to limit themselves. Otherwise, they are bankrupted, and the government didn't help them, the governments. So the third crisis, this pandemic, again, this is empowering the state establishments. In order to live, stay alive, you have to be a good state citizen, favorable citizen. Otherwise, the state can easily take you out from the system, and you don't have anything to help you. For me, there is another crisis coming, not only one crisis. I think there are two crises at the door. One of them is the digital crisis. It is related to cryptocurrencies and the digital cyber system, the social medias, these kind of things. The state establishments has to fight with these non-state digital powers. Otherwise, they will lose another realm. I mean, in the digital realm, they have to be powerful, and they need to control the system, because they're going to force the crypto systems to collapse. I think the fourth crisis will be on the digital level. And the fifth one, it can be a crisis of climate issues. The climate means the human mobilizations, and it's going to push us to our caves again. It's going to change the production systems. It's going to change the ways we live, the city systems, the housing facilities, everything that we have. I mean, maybe the car systems, the new energy systems. So when you change the energy systems, the model, then Middle East, for example, who are providing the most important energy factors, the fossil fuels, and the Caucasus, for example, they're going to lose ground. And it's going to change the geopolitical maps in our minds very easily. There's going to be new centers of political shifts. So let me ask you another question about that. How do you think the new crisis may come in what dimensions? Do you agree with me that there is a potential for new global crisis, or solidarity of the communities will help us handling all these kind of problems before they became and transform into global crises?
Well, you flagged up a number of things, but a certain number of fundamental principles. This question of governments taking control, feeling they need to take control, and less freedom for individuals. And you have found yourself, for example, and others, having to retreat from the public space that you were inhabiting. You've stayed in the public space, but in a different kind of way, very carefully. Here's the dilemma that I have found myself. As you know, I'm a doctor, and I'm interested in obviously in issues of conflict. But when the pandemic strikes, of course, my reaction is to look at it from a medical point of view. And I would like people to get vaccinated, and I would like effective vaccines and so on. And that is, in some senses, a very rational proposition, you know, that we know that this can work. We know there are limits to it, but we know that it can work. But then there are some people who feel very unhappy about it for a whole lot of reasons. Some of them are unhappy because they're being pressed. Some of them are unhappy because they're suspicious. Some of them have concerns about safety, and so on and so on and so on. But the result of this, I notice, is a split, is a division between those who are accepting the need for vaccination and so on, and others who are saying, no, I don't want to be pushed in that kind of direction. And I find myself in a dilemma, because one part of my instincts is to say, but you have to do this. This isn't just a question of you. We need herd immunity. We can't get that simply by infection. We have to get it by vaccination. If you don't get vaccinated, it's not just a question of your health or your children's health or your friends' health. It's the health of the whole community, and not just this country, but other countries as well, and so on and so on. So one part of me gets increasingly energized by the idea that it's really important for people to get vaccinated. Another part of me is a liberal politician. And I'm saying, well, I want to persuade people and I want to encourage people, but what happens when you start forcing people? Then you get adverse reactions against that, and people start splitting again along that line, but also along other lines. So the first dilemma for me is this dilemma of finding myself becoming part of this process of splitting, of polarization. I'm not really knowing what to do about it, because I can see the argument on both sides. The one thing that I have held to in recent times was written in a book by an old friend of ours, Ed Shapiro. And Ed is a very senior psychoanalyst who's interested in the public sphere. And when he was asked, Ed, after a lifetime involved in this, what have you learned? And it's very difficult to put into a short amount of space the kind of amount of stuff you've learned in a lifetime like Ed Shapiro's. But he did, he put it in one sentence. He said, the thing that I've learned is to ask myself always the question, this person that I disagree with, what are they right about? In other words, there is no simple answer to any of these questions. If somebody has a different perspective, they have that for a reason. It may not necessarily be the reason that they give, but there is a reason for it. And so when I have very little political sympathy with, for example, Donald Trump, but the fact that half of the American people supported this guy tells me that there's something there that cannot be ignored, and actually should not be ignored. It needs to be explored, not ignored. It's not a question of necessarily taking it simply at face value, but it must be explored. This is becoming increasingly difficult to do because people on both sides of the argument are saying, no, this is not about asking questions. You have to do what I say. Or on the other hand, you have to stop doing what the government is saying. And this notion of disruption has become very powerful, so that there are many people who are using technology and political tactics and AI and cyber and so on to create disruption. They see the things you're describing government doing, controlling, forcing, pressing people, taking authority to themselves and so on and so on. And they say, we don't like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to disrupt it. We're going to use technology and all sorts of other devices to disrupt it. Then that's all very fine, if you've got some kind of idea what you want to replace it with. This kind of disruption happened 500 years ago with the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. But those people had some idea of what they wanted to replace it with. They wanted to say, right, we don't want kings and bishops telling us what to think and what to do. We want ordinary people, everybody, to have a vote, to be able to be educated, to read, to write, to discuss, to debate, to have their own vote. And we spent the last few hundred years getting more and more people to vote. The problem is we have found that that on its own hasn't worked. People are getting less and less committed to the notion of democracy rather than more and more committed to it. So I suppose the dilemma that I find myself in is taking seriously what you're describing, that there is this overreach of authority by governments and that there is this negative response to it, and that both have to be taken seriously. But I suppose the dilemma for me, the impulse for me, is both to try to understand it and to say, if we are to experience, whether we do it or whether we just experience it, this disruption that you're describing in pretty nearly every aspect of life, do I simply retreat to my cave, pull in a stone to keep the bad guys out, build a fire, keep myself warm, and just hope that the kids survive? Or do I have any capacity to develop a vision that says what life might be able to look like beyond the cave? And I suppose, you know, I'm interested, you've described this phenomenon, and I think it's a very interesting description. And putting things in pictures is much more powerful. As we all know in politics, the political cartoonist is much more powerful with a single cartoon than any of us are in making speeches. So putting it in a picture like that, as you've done, is very powerful. But do you have any kind of thoughts or ideas about what we might do beyond the cave with all its protections and retreat.
Well, John, you have described everything like always. I mean, very importantly, and you have mentioned this vaccination issue. And nowadays I'm reading about that, and I am following how the country is split into two. Very interesting. There was the main fault line in Turkey has always been the religious and the secular fault line. Now this has changed. This disappeared, and there is another fault line, the ones who are thinking that this is a global pandemic, and the ones who think that this is a global plandemic, a conspiracy done by the big pharma industries or the United States, Israel, these kind of things. So the ones who are anti-vaccination, who support anti-vaccination, the ones who want others to be vaccinated. I found myself in the same dilemma too. I'm vaccinated, but there are people around me, my friends, who doesn't want to vaccinate themselves, and each other. I mean, we all call ourselves the ones who protest vaccination campaigns. They are ignorant, and when they look at us, they say we are not smart enough to believe in the conspiratorial actors of world politics. So half of the population is ignorant, half of the population is stupid. This is the main division. They think in that way, but it is becoming more and more politicized. It's going to be reflected in the voting systems too. Even for AKP, Erdogan is vaccinated, and he wants the people to be vaccinated, and he wants to open up all the economic life. But his supporters, his constituency, is mostly anti-vax. I mean, thinks that it is a conspiracy. So he cannot put strict measures to people. He wants to convince the people, but there are lots of different factors, different actors who are creating new informations coming from United States, coming from Britain. A professor from Britain says that the science, this is all a conspiracy. There is not a pandemic. This is like, this is the same case. I mean, before it was always the same. People were dying because of diseases. There is nothing has changed. So this is just a plan. And there are pandemics and infodemics. I mean, this is the main division. So another dilemma is we the liberals cannot, I mean, we cannot be on the side of the strict measures. I mean, we don't want to force people to get vaccinated. This is a mandate over their bodies, okay? I mean, we didn't want to do that. But when we look at China, Russia, their systems, they're not liberal, but their systems are much more powerful in fighting all the crises, not only with the pandemic. They fought well against terrorism issue, the security issues. They fought better than liberal countries in the economic crisis. They fought better in pandemics. They fought better than the liberal countries, actually. So I'm afraid at the end of this pandemic, if the vaccines do not work well, if new variants of the virus continue to emerge, the notion of science, the belief for science will collapse. The values of enlightenment will collapse. So it is very, I mean, it is a cave. In a cave society, you cannot talk about enlightenment. There would be caves, different caves of, I mean, the vaccinated caves of the vaccinated people, caves of the other ones. And in that case, you don't talk about culture, liberal values, freedoms, and these kind of things. You're going to isolate yourself from each other. And if science cannot manage to come over this pandemic, our beliefs to science, for sure, there's going to be lots of more information for digging the hole of the pandemic and bury it to its grave, the science to bury to its grave. There will be lots of ignorant people, religious people, who will use that opportunity to use this as their fight against science. So the reflections of it, with this pandemic, at the end of this pandemic, maybe next year, the other year, I'm not sure when it's going to end, but the incapacity of science may create new motivations towards this middle age values. Actually, I'm afraid with that. How do you think? I mean, Umberto Eco says that we're living in a new middle age. The religious values are changing, the relations, the obedience to our leaders, the kings. We're electing our kings. Now we're voting for our kings. I mean, this is the same. How do you think about that?
Well, I think that is the worry, that we find ourselves slipping into a new dark age, as you say. I remember some years ago, I was out in Tunisia because at this stage, this was the old Tunisian government before the Arab Spring, and they were trying to develop a niche market in tourism, which was archaeology tourism, because there's still lots of old buildings and so on. And they asked me and a few other colleagues to go out and look at some of these things. And they took us to a remarkable museum of mosaics from the Roman times. And first of all, we went to see one, and it was just extraordinary, wonderful colors, almost looked three-dimensional when you stood back from it. It was just magnificent. Then the next one was fairly primitive looking. It wasn't anything like so elaborate or beautiful or impressive. And the guide said, well, as you can see, these are rather different. Which of them do you think came first? And I looked at it and I said, well, you know, this one on the left-hand side is incredibly impressive and huge skill involved in producing this. The one on the right, it's nice, but it's rather more primitive. So I assume that it came, the more primitive one came first, and then the skills developed and the resources were made available. This much more beautiful one was produced. He said, yes, I thought you'd say that, but that's not the case. The more complex one is older than the more naive one. And I said, how on earth did that happen? Well, he said what happened was this. It was quite a difficult thing to get elected to one of the Senate seats from Carthage to the Senate in Rome. And so what they did was they would spend more and more money to get elected. And they would, for example, build a public building, and they would make it very beautiful. They would employ artisans to produce a beautiful mosaic for the floor and pictures for the walls and so on and so on. And it just got more and more expensive until at some point, people began to realize that the amount of money they were spending to get elected to a Senate seat was so much that they couldn't pay it off in their own lifetime. Their own children would still be paying off the debt for the money that they had spent to get themselves elected. And they just said, this is mad. We're not going to do it anymore. And so they withdrew from that kind of thing. Now you might look at it and say, well, that was a good thing, surely. Well, no, because what happened was the people with ability and understanding and money and so on withdrew from the public space. Now, I'm a little bit reminded of what has been happening to you, withdrew from the public space, and therefore politics became inhabited by people with much less money, yes, but less sophistication, less understanding. And it was the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. And I guess what shocked me about that was that I had grown up with a perspective that progress might not always be smooth, but at least it was not fundamentally reversible. And what I discovered was it is fundamentally reversible. And civilizations can come and go. I remember being out in Lebanon and looking at a piece of archaeology that had been done, and it cut down through 14 different civilizations. Some of them I knew, some of them I'd never heard of, and they were whole civilizations. And I think we have got to recognize with some seriousness that there is no guarantee that things will continue in a progressive way, or even that the progress we thought has been progress may not actually be progress. We may have made some serious errors along the way. There's a German theologian and philosopher, Jürgen Moltmann, who's now in his 90s, but he came to London just the March just before the lockdown, and he was preaching or speaking in Westminster Abbey. And he told this story. He was talking both about war and about the environment. And the story was of two planets or stars that were passing each other in the skies. And as they passed, One of them said to the other, "How are you?" And the first one replied and said, "Actually, I'm not terribly well. I've got a very bad dose of humanity." And the other one said, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but don't worry about it. It'll soon pass." And I think that is the reality that we have got to face. There is nothing that says humanity has a right to exist. And if we are not rather thoughtful about it, that may pass. So it is very important for us, those of us that think we may not have a right to exist, but we think we have a contribution to make to the universe, to actually develop our ideas and think about things and see ourselves in a somewhat different context, perhaps, in order to survive and to thrive. And I don't think that's at all impossible, but I think it may be more of a challenge than we understood before all of these things started to happen.
Yeah, you're right, John. Actually, this civilization issue, this humanity, I mean, there is always this change. This is the rule of nature. Change is the rule of nature, but it shouldn't be in a progressive manner. I mean, sometimes it's regressive. So there are times that we retreat ourselves from what's going on around us. Sometimes we get into it, we try for it, we work for it, and sometimes it's in a progressive way. But the main interesting thing, I mean, actually, you have mentioned, brought something to my mind. I mean, in the agricultural civilization, there is this output, political output of this agricultural civilization. It lasted for more than 2,000 years, actually, from the hunter-gatherer society. This agricultural mode of life brought us a political structure. I mean, this is the empires and kingdoms, the feudal states, these kind of things. The political output was that. Then suddenly we passed to the industrial society, and this industrial society brought us a new political mode, a nation state mode. This is not, the republics were there. I mean, this was very important for us. Kingdoms transformed into nation states. The multinational empires turned into uniform nation states. Then came the post-industrial society. It's another economic production model, actually, and its output was the global society, global governance, global belief systems, borderless, I mean, a global village, these kind of things. It was a more liberal, more democratic understanding at those times. But since that, we entered into a new mode of production, the Industry 4.0, starting from the 2010s. It has to have a new political output. What is it going to be like? I mean, if the robots will produce, if there is the artificial intelligence there, if it is the main factor is going to be technology, what will be the main political output? And it seems to me that unfortunately it looks like a totalitarian political model that gathers all the data from the society, from the individual, and creates a domination, by a political domination on the states. Unfortunately, I mean, because the states, the ones who rules all the people, may not need any people around them. I mean, may not need the societies. The main issue can become, it's like scientific movies for me. I'm afraid from the future, it seems to me. I mean, I don't like what's coming next.